Hello and welcome to my channel. Today is April 13th, 2021, and it is Riot season. That's right, it's Riot season. And riots only hurt the communities that take place. And I got a couple stories I'm going to read. Let's see how far I'm going to do for them. I only glance at the headlines, but let's see what they have to say. We got the first one, which is from vianews.com. Economic damage from civil unrest may persist for decades. Washington, already reeling from the coronavirus pandemic and unemployment levels not seen since the Great Depression. Cities across the United States smoldered on Tuesday after the seventh consecutive night of protests and civil unrest related to the death of African American Mr. Floyd while in custody of Minneapolis police last week. Business owners and residents yet clean up the debris, and there's growing concerns that the economic damage many of the communities where violence is taking place will persist long after the last window pane is replaced and the last burnt out car is towed away. Now keep in mind this was written on June 1st, 2020. So I'm pretty sure there's going to be a repeat. Businesses in neighborhoods where the protests have turned violent will have to contend not that with the aftermath of the protests, but with multiple aggraving factors that will make the recovery even more difficult, like a not guilty verdict or the manslaughter verdict, but not the first degree and second degree. Many businesses have already been pushed to the edge of sovereignties by months of lockdown related to the coronavirus and the slow and careful reopening envisioned by many state and local leaders have not designed to allow commerce to rebound to pre-pandemic levels immediately. Later, on top of that, the depression level unemployment currently affecting the nation and the prospect of the economy that will, at the very least, be in a recession for the foreseeable future. On Tuesday, the Congressional Budget Office delivered an analysis to Congress warning that the virus will adversely impact the economy through much of the next decade, cutting some of $8 trillion from gross domestic product over that period. Another distant possibility of the second wave of coronavirus. Is this a coronavirus? I thought it was a protest. Anyways, let's go over here. Disagreement over the origins of violence. There's been a disagreement much with the protests, claiming that people unaffiliated with their movement have been co-opting it to their own purpose. In some cases, state and local officials have said that they believe that agitators are coming in from outside the communities and are being targeted. Whoever is responsible, yada yada yada. Yeah, the depressed property values. William Collins and Robert Margot studied the effect of riots following the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. in 1960. Found the areas most affected by the destruction. Property values were measurably depressed in years immediately following the riots, remained so until 1980s at least. Precisely the measure of the economic and civil disorder is difficult. They're right because existing data are imperfect. However, we find significant difference between black-owned property values trends in cities that had medium or severe riots compared to cities with minor disturbances. And another study looked at the progress of neighborhoods affected by civil disorder in 1968. Mark Cassie and Bradley Harley also found long-term, if not permanent, negative impacts. And here's one from the Washington Post. Unrest can harm the people it's meant to help. Here's how to support them. And this was written in June 9th, 2020. So this isn't a new article. Raphael A. Mongol, a fellow and deputy director of legal policy at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research and contributing editor of City Journal. History illustrates that their noblest peaceful protests can inspire meaningfully change. Terrible injustice suffered by Floyd sparked spontaneous movement meant to diminish racial disparity, and peaceful demonstration had an opportunity to advance the cause. But in places where protests descended into looting, arson, arson, and violence, the results could be the opposite as cities try to recover in the weeks and months ahead. They should focus on how to mitigate the negative effects of lawlessness on economic opportunity and public safety, which could end up exacerbating the two of the biggest challenges facing black and brown neighborhoods in and around American cities. One economic front, history offers some clues about the scars of unrest may leave behind, while nationwide riots in the 1960s and Los Angeles riots in 1992 were much larger in scope than the recent violence. Analysts of their economic impact suggest it could take years for some of the communities to bounce back. A 2007 study published in the Journal of Economic History, for example, found that the riots of 1960 led to significant population loss and depressed medium value of black owned property between 1960 and 1970, with little to no rebound in the 1970s. More recently, a 2004 report of urban studies found that 1992 Rodney King riots resulted in a cumulative loss of at least 3.8 billion in taxable sales, over 125 million in direct sales tax revenues for Los Angeles, and images of boarded up businesses destroyed in Ferguson reminds us that a city still hasn't recovered from the disturbance of 2014. The economic damage may be compounded by the erosion of public safety, the broken window theory of policing, recognizing the link between visible disorder and serious crime. Much of the broken windows left unrepaired may lead to the destruction of others because it sends a message that no one will intervene to fix them. So too does ignoring low-level offenses committed in public spaces, ultimately inviting more serious criminality. When people look around their neighborhood and see vagrants and defaced property, they understandably retreat in fear, emboldening gangs, drug dealers, thieves, and other serious criminals to move in. Most of the demonstration protesting George Floyd deaths have been peaceful, especially over the past few days, but many of the lasting mental images and recent violence and literal broken windows, graffiti monuments, burnt out buildings, and looted storefronts left in their wake could contribute to heightened sense of fear of some living in the affected communities. The scars of the public disorder are widespread and the people have retreated from public spaces. Broken window theory, as well as the research a link between built environment and the crime suggests without swift efforts of restoring normalcy and the increase of criminal activity may not be far off. This is especially true with the police pullback, as some protesters are pushing defund the police, now advocating recent research and past experience suggests law enforcement might retreat regardless after protests wrecked Chicago in 2015 following the death of LaQuinta McDonald. City policing became much less aggressive. The consequences were captured in a study published in the University of Illinois Law Review showing that a sharp drop in pedestrian stop was likely a cause of 245 additional homicides that year, concentrated in minority neighborhoods. A similar decline in enforcement of Baltimore police after Freddie Gray protests had been followed by the dramatic rise of annual homicides, with Charm City experiencing record high homicide rate in 2019. Rather than entertain calls to defund the police should be considering more practical approaches to mitigating these effects, and their efforts should be targeted. Central business districts are more likely to have access to resources needed to rebound. City leaders must do their best to ensure that more modest, largest minority neighborhoods affected in Minneapolis, Philadelphia, St. Louis, Chicago, Louisville, Atlanta, and other cities are not left behind. The best way to start making the physical environment of damaged communities less vulnerable to more serious crime research. Recent research by the University of Pennsylvania criminology John McDonald shows that abating vacant lots by making productive use of abandoned properties. Cities can help mitigate the conditions that lead to crime, which suggests municipalities and cooperative groups should literally clean up the mess and quickly. For their part, the police leaders must redouble their efforts to ensure officers follow training and protocols that can prevent the deaths like in George Floyd, like William McDonald and Freddie Gray, and take swifter action to hold accountable for those that have abused their power, but they must simultaneously do all they can do to boost the morale of the officers in their command and remind them of their public support. Overshadowing in the recent days of chaos, they still rightly enjoy. It would be tragic if the aftermath of George Floyd's death worsens conditions in the Americans' urban minority neighborhoods. Getting these solutions right for our best hope in avoiding the bleak outcome that have followed earlier episodes of civil unrest. Man, that was a mouthful. But I do have this third one from the Quillette. I think they're more of a right leaning publication, so let's see what they have to say. American black communities are suffering. Violent protests will make the suffering worse. This was published in May 30th, 2020. Protests sparked by George Floyd, blah, 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 blah. We already know this. Numerous small businesses have been destroyed. At least one elderly shopper at Target was assaulted. A man had been shot dead. This pattern of events familiar because it repeats itself numerous times over American history following acts of police brutality, especially in cases where Floyd, with the victim, was black. First, a large number of people protest peacefully, drawing attention to their cause and attracting a national sympathy. Then a smaller group turns violent, causing the destruction of the community and sometimes harming innocent people. The smaller groups sometimes include people who exploit the chaos to their own ends. During the Baltimore riots of 2015, for the instance of looting a pharmacy led to opioids and other drugs flooding the market, likely feeding the drug dependency and enriching gangs and fueling more crime. In the 1960s, thousands of Americans took part in the nonviolent protests opposing segregation. Their efforts helped lead the passage of the Voting Rights Acts and the Civil Rights Acts, but later, half a decade more, or many protests became a sense of violence. In 1967 alone, there were 159 riots in major cities. Such riots are often cast form of righteous outrage and progressive often unwilling to denounce or even discourage them. Warren Gunnels, the senior staff of Senator Bernie Sanders, seems to downplay the events in Minneapolis for the instance of describing the growing wealth inequality in the U.S. as the true form of looting. All right, being successful is not looting. Being successful is just being successful. Such response summons the mind of image that rioters as underprivileged individuals punching up from their downtrodden place in society, but often to extent to embrace moral framework. Their violence is counterproductive. Leading over 600 billionaires increasing their wealth by 434 billions in 2 months of the pandemic is the cause of over 38 millions losing their job. Blah, 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 blah. Yeah, who cares? In a recent published research article, American Political Science examined the impact of different forms of protests on public opinion. Princeton University professor Omar Walson, a veteran researcher in the sphere of race and policy, focused exclusively on black-led protests and how they were received by the public. The overarching question that led me to the study the 1960 protests was a puzzle I thought about a lot while growing up in New York, which may be summarized of how we got as a country shift from victories of civil rights areas to the rise of law and order. Walsall told me in an interview, both my parents had been activists in the civil rights movements. For example, my father went to Mississippi to register voters as a part of the Freedom Summer. So partly this was personal. Also, as I was growing up, I was trying to understand what had happened in the wake of those success that left us with policies like the war on drugs and mass incarceration. His studies found that nonviolent activism, like the practice by the Student of Nonviolent Coordination Committee, the SNCC, in the American South, moved public towards supporting civil rights and even increasing the vote share for Democratic president candidates in the country, rather geographically proximate to protests. This effect was particularly evident when the nonviolent protesters were met with violence, as was the frequent case with the SNCC. And it isn't hard to imagine why. People feel sympathy towards the innocent protesters being brutalized by the racist mob and authoritarian seeming police officers. The effect of the violent protesters, however, seemed to have the opposite effect. Indeed, Wassel believes that the violent protests caused a shift among whites towards Republicans large enough to tip the scale in 1968 with the presidential election to Richard Nixon. As scenes of violence protests shift, the news coverage delete discourse on public opinion towards the theme of social control. Members of Congress were deluged with torrents of constituents' mail in favor of the 1968 Safe Street Bills. Walser writes, quoting that research of the Yale professor Velsa Weaver, even liberal Democrats felt compelled by public anxiety over crime and riots to vote for the bill. Polling data from August 1968 finds 80% of the respondents agree with the statement law and order has broken down in this country. The final analyst, Wilson, believes that the violent protests push white radical moderates from the Midwest to Mid Atlantic into law and order coalition to help tip the presidency into the Republican Party. Also conceded that the transformation egalitarian coalition created in the early 1960s has always been fragile, but that in the absence of violent protests would likely have held together long enough to put Democrat Hubert Humphrey lead into the author of the Civil Rights in 1964 into the presidency. In this alternate timeline, the Republican Party might not have become focused on law and order campaign and the governing strategy that remains with us to this day, which led along the way to the war on drugs and mass incarceration. The consequences were merely foretold by some civil rights movements, including Reverend Martin Luther King. It's common on social media to see people quoting King's statement that riots is the language of the unheard, but the same remarks from which it was popular quote drawn. King also stated that the riots are social destructive and self-defeating. On February 1968, 9 months before Richard Nixon election, King warned that the increased rioting would lead to a right-wing takeover. He pointed to the segregation George Wallace President bid, saying, every time a riot develops, that helps George Wallace. They'll throw us into concentration camps, they told supporters. The Poor People Campaign, Wallace and the followers of John Birch Society will take over. The sick people and the fascists will be straightened, and they'll cordon off the ghetto, and the issue passes for us to get in and out. I'm kind of glad that part didn't happen. We cannot stand 2 more summers like last summer without leading inevitably to right-wing takeover and a fascist state that will destroy the soul of our nation. It's kind of ironic that the Democrats are now the fascists. It's interesting how they thought the personal responsibility, states' rights would lead to fascism, but now we're actually seeing fascism through the corporations led by the Democratic Party. King's assassination, his widow, Coretta Scott King, used her remarks at the Atlanta Ebenezer Baptist Church to implore his admirers to continue to act in accordance with his peaceful council. Our concern now is that his work does not die. He gave his life for the poor of the world, the garbage workers of Memphis, and the peasants of Vietnam. Nothing could hurt him more than a man that could attempt to no way solve the problems except through violence. She said he gave his life in search of a more excellent way, a more effective way of creating rather than the destructive way we intend to go in search of the way. I hope that you and your loved and admired him would join us with fulfilling his dream. In recent days of George Floyd's girlfriend said something similar about Floyd would have wanted his memorials to act. In the short term, violence can produce some high visibility benefits for victims' communities, but it's very possible for the instance that Chauvin would never have been criminally charged, but not for the nation attention focused on Minneapolis. Thanks to the violent protests and in 2014 violence from Ferguson, Missouri led to police training involvement in other policies, but the long term economic and social consequences of violence are almost inevitable negative for the local community. I think you kind of get the gist. Riots don't work. They may have short term gains, but it's kind of like winning the battle but losing the war. Leave a comment down below what your thoughts are. Smash the like and subscribe button on all platforms. But most importantly, stay peaceful and have yourself a wonderful day, morning, or evening.